Locke on Natural Law and Property Rights by David Snyder. Whether John Locke's two treatises is a justification of revolution or a demand for revolution, it is a book about political revolution. Yet it is also a book about property. This is not so only because of the obviously central place that Locke's discussion of property holds in the second treatise, but also because his account of when revolution is justified hinges, in three crucial respects, on his account of how private or exclusive rights to property arise. The first of these respects concerns Locke's notion that there can be no injustice when there is no property. Revolution is justified only, of course, when civil government is unjust. But if for Locke injustice is just a denial of property rights, then he needs a theory of property rights to satisfactorily establish when revolution is justified. Thus, a theory of legitimate property ownership is necessary for Locke to give an account of revolution. Now, it must be remembered that Locke's definition of property is a wide one indeed. For although he often uses the term to signify material goods, he defines it as lives, liberties, and estates. Consequently, we must not assume that for him exclusive ownership of goods is necessary for injustice to occur. Denial of liberty, for example, can also constitute injustice. However, since goods are part of what he means by property, he needs an explanation of why one is entitled to one's goods to give a complete justification of revolution. Second, Locke needs a theory of property to show why free men would obligate themselves to civil government. His answer is that they do so to protect their property, part of which is goods. And since property protection is the reason men consent to be governed in the first place, when their government no longer fulfills that task, revolution is justified. Third, Locke needs a theory of property to explain why political authority is legitimate. One cannot say when political authority exceeds its proper bounds if one cannot say what those bounds are. And for Locke, part of what constitutes the limits to government is the limits of men's willingness to be governed. In other words, men consent only to that which betters their lot, and if government is legitimate, it must be a good bargain for the governed. But it will not be a good bargain if the government itself systematically violates property rights or allows them to be violated. Thus, even though the basis for property ownership in the state of nature changes to some extent once civil society is instituted, if government exists to protect property rights in its extended sense, and if government is legitimate only if it is sufficiently successful in carrying out its task so that the governed continue to extend their consent, then Locke's explanation of how exclusive property rights arise is an important ingredient in his theory of civil authority and obligation. It has recently become increasingly apparent that Locke's theory of property cannot be understood apart from his view of natural law. Although this makes his justification of property acquisition a bit more complex than is recognized by some commentators, as well as, given Locke's assumptions, much more interesting, nonetheless, I do not think we presently have an adequate understanding of how, for him, exclusive property ownership is possible. One purpose of this paper is to attempt, then, a further exploration of the relationship between his doctrine of natural law and his justification of property acquisition in the state of nature. Second, my analysis of this relationship uncovers new problems with Locke's view. In carrying out this task, I argue that some other attempts to criticize him will not do. My account seeks to avoid these pitfalls by being sensitive both to Locke's assumptions and to his successes and failures in argument. 1. Locke's theory of natural law. Locke pointedly rejects the view that bases property rights on consent. In his eyes, the right to property is natural, or precontractual. It antedates not only civil society, but also other types of social arrangements. So to show that individual property ownership is morally justified, he must appeal to some other prescriptive principle or set of principles. In Locke's scheme, these principles turn out to be the laws of nature. So to understand why he thinks that persons have property rights, it is important to first consider his view of natural law. John Yolton has claimed that Locke's use of the law of nature must be viewed in the context of the doctrine of innate knowledge. This is true because to understand his concept of natural law, it is important to note not only what Locke argues against in his attack on the dogma of innate knowledge, but what he accepts. If this is not done, one might mistakenly conclude that Locke's acceptance of a doctrine of natural law is inconsistent with his well-known rejection of innate knowledge in the essay. Now, this possibility of confusion is abated by Locke's own language. In the second treatise, he refers to the law of nature as writ in the hearts of all mankind. Moreover, in his essays on law of nature, he claims that this law is innate. On the face of it, Locke's use of such language to describe his own doctrine of natural law is inconsistent with his polemic in the essay against innate knowledge, the latter of which he describes as primary notions, characters, as it were, stamped upon the mind of man. However, this apparent contradiction is only superficial. Although Locke argues that we do not have truths imprinted upon our minds from birth, indeed he rejects the claim that we do as not merely false but nonsensical, he never says that we have no innate capacity of reason or that there are no principles discoverable by the understanding alone. Self-evident truths are self-evident not because they are innately impressed upon the mind, but because it is impossible to believe to the contrary. Moreover, although the doctrine of innate knowledge of principles must be rejected, if those who support this view mean merely that we have an innate rational capacity for knowledge, then their point is true but trivial. Thus, even though Locke attacks the doctrine of innate knowledge, he does believe that the mind has the capacity to gain knowledge of some principles through reason alone. Second, in the ELN, he states that his conception of natural law, as known via the light of nature, does not commit him to embracing the doctrine of innate knowledge. In his third essay, entitled Is Law of Nature Inscribed in the Minds of Men? No, he considers and rejects the view that the laws of nature are innate. Since Locke takes an entire essay to tell us that on his view natural law is not innate in the objectionable sense, it should be clear that according to him, anyway, there is no inconsistency here. This makes Laslet's comment, that Locke seemed to be aware of his inconsistency on this point, somewhat curious and most certainly incorrect. Moreover, as von Leyden has demonstrated, the arguments in the ELN against the idea that the law of nature is innate are incorporated into Book 1 of the essay itself. Locke is arguing in the same way against a single view in both the essay and the ELN. Consequently, if the ELN and the essay are inconsistent, the inconsistency is within the ELN itself and not primarily between it and the essay. Lastly, there is one passage in which Locke unequivocally and clearly distinguishes his view of natural law from innate knowledge. As this passage settles the issue, I quote it in full. We do not maintain that this law of nature, written as it were on tablets, lies open in our hearts, and that as soon as some inward light comes near it, like a torch approaching a notice board hung up in the darkness, it is at length read, perceived, and noted by the rays of that light. Rather, by saying that something can be known by the light of nature, we mean nothing else but that there is some sort of truth, to the knowledge of which a man can attain by himself, and without the help of another, if he makes proper use of the faculties he is endowed with by nature. It is not inconsistent for Locke to hold on the one hand that the notion of innate knowledge is a myth, and on the other that there are self-evident principles to which the rational man will readily assent. For it is the ability to discover these truths, not the truths themselves, that is innate. There is much more to natural law, however, than simply being known by man. Throughout the ELN, Locke also calls it the law of reason, and for two reasons this should not be taken to refer to its epistemic status. First, when he discusses the origins of our knowledge of the law of nature, he asserts that reason cannot be that origin. Second, and more important, near the beginning of the first essay, he equates moral good with the law of right reason, stating that these and other terms all refer to the law of nature. At this point, he distinguishes between reason as a faculty of the mind and as a moral law which decrees principles of action and obedience to which is rational. By reason, however, I do not think is meant here that faculty of the understanding which forms trains of thought and deduces proofs, but certain definite principles of action from which springs all virtues and whatever is necessary for the proper molding of morals. For that which is correctly derived from these principles is justly said to be in accordance with right reason. Now, as Yulton points out, Locke was seeking to justify a system of morality by grounding the moral law in something objective. But what is this something objective upon which the law of nature is founded? Locke contends that it is simply the divine will. Natural law is part of the decree of God, who, being entirely rational, only decrees those moral principles that are in conformity with himself, i.e., those in conformity with rational nature. Furthermore, although this law is known by the mind, it is called the law of reason primarily because it ordains principles of action that are morally right and, at the same time, rational. Since all men are created rational, Locke argues, the law of nature is universally binding. Locke is seeking to ground right action upon a natural law which is part of the will of God. This law is discoverable by the human mind, but more importantly, it prescribes moral, rational action. Any action not in accordance with its precepts is in defiance of the divine will, and hence contradicts reason itself. But actions in accordance with natural law are right, moral, and rational. Number 2. Natural law and the two treaties. Locke begins in the second treatise by describing the state of nature, which is human society as it exists apart from the civil state. Although there is no government in this natural condition, that does not mean that there is no moral law which ought to be obeyed. Indeed, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everybody. Furthermore, this law of nature wills the peace and preservation of all mankind. Later, we are told that the preservation of man is the fundamental law of nature. One ambiguity occurring throughout the two treatises is that, on the one hand, Locke identifies natural law with God's will in general, and on the other he sometimes speaks of certain laws of nature as prescribing specific actions, such as the duty to preserve others. That is, sometimes he writes as if the law of nature is singular, and other times as if it encompasses many different laws. There is no problem here, however, if we pay attention to the context within which these words occur. Natural law is part of God's will, but what God primarily wills is the peace and preservation of mankind. Thus, these are the fundamental precepts of this law. Any actions that promote peace and preservation are also laws of nature in the sense that since they do aid in the fulfillment of God's law, or since they may even be necessary for the fulfillment of God's law, they are derivable from natural law, and so are properly called the laws of nature. Now, the state of nature is, for Locke, a condition of equality and freedom, at least it is initially. Since no one enjoys legitimate political power over another, all men order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit. But even this state of freedom is limited, for the rational law which governs it decrees principles of actions which promote peace and preservation. One may not simply do as one wishes, if what one wishes to do is contrary to the law of nature, for everyone is morally bound by that law. One principle derivable from the law, for example, is that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Since this principle is derivable from the law of nature, it is necessary for peace and preservation, and so is a part of that law. Observing it is obedience to the rational will of God and is one expression of human rationality.